I joked he's still a virgin at 35 in front of everyone. He got his revenge days later. You know, sometimes you make so many mistakes in your life that it feels like you are a living mistake. And that is my story. I made mistakes as frequently as I breathed, especially with my mouth. It's like the moment I open my mouth, the wrong things just start flowing out without any filter or restrictions. And the tragic thing was that I accepted that as who I was. It was egoistic and self-serving because most times it was other people on the wrong end of my tongue. And that didn't change even when I met Henry. Our relationship didn't start like the usual man approaches woman or woman approaches man. He was minding his business when I tripped on a flight of stairs and fell, hitting my head. He was close by, and being the active fellow that he was, he rushed me to a nearby hospital. That just showed how caring he was, but what was more touching to me was that when I regained consciousness, I saw him waiting there for me. It was like he didn't want me to wake up alone. And I was happy that he was there, even though I didn't know who he was. From there, things became wonderful between us. We started dating about a month later, and it was one of the best decisions I ever made in my life. I felt like I won the lottery, and my sister Alice even confirmed it. She would always tell me that I got too lucky with Henry, and I knew she was right, but I always answered her by saying that she was saying nonsense. Henry and I were so in love with each other, and he helped me redefine what love meant. He made me know just how pure and caring and considerate it could be, but something happened that surprised me entirely. I think that was barely 2 or 3 months into our relationship. It was clear that this was something serious. It was clear that we were not joking with each other, and we meant business. We loved each other very much, and we were not playing games with one another. So of course, I thought it was time for us to take a step further in our relationship. Honestly, it had never even crossed my mind that we had not been intimate with each other throughout the time we were together. But when I hung out with my sister and she saw how I was smiling and laughing at everything she said like she was the funniest person in the world, she thought something was off. She asked me if my boyfriend satisfied me that well before I came to see her. I was really startled by this sudden statement that I laughed and told her to mind her business. But then it made me think. Henry had never made any intimate advances at me. Yeah, we kissed and we hugged and we cuddled whenever I was over at his place or he was over at mine. It suddenly made me worried. The first thought that came to my mind was perhaps he was a eunuch, and as such, he didn't have the desire for me in that manner. It made me honestly worried. I got home later that day, but I kept thinking about it. The thought that I was dating an incomplete man was very disturbing to me because that was the only logical explanation for him to not make any intimate advances at me throughout the months we had been together. And he was so loving and present that I didn't even notice that we hadn't crossed that line yet in all the time that we were together. I lay on my bed to try and get some rest, but my mind kept working nonstop. The thought still plagued me so much, and the next thing I knew, I sprang out of bed and grabbed my bag. I went straight to Henry's house, and I knocked on his door like I was a landlord who was knocking on an owing tenant's house. He was honestly shocked when he opened the door and saw me there. He called my name in surprise and asked me what was going on and if I was okay. I told him I was not okay, and he immediately invited me inside to hear what was wrong. After he closed the door, he held my hand and asked what was wrong. It was so romantic and wonderful, and it almost blew my mind from what I came there to do. He looked at me with worry in his eyes, and I must say, that look was heart-touching and sweet. I felt like he was enchanting me, so I had to shake my head to get him out of my head, after which I opened my mouth, and the most obscene question flew out of my mouth. I asked him if he was a eunuch. He was more confused than me in math class when I was in high school. The only word that could escape his mouth was, "What?" I knew that I poured it on him like a bag of rocks, so I had to process the words again and bring them out in the best way I could. But remember what I said about my mouth not having a filter and the wrong things coming out. Another thought came into my mouth, and I blatantly asked him if he was impotent. His eyes widened, and he asked me what the hell was going on. I was lucky that he didn't take offense to it, because I just kept saying the wrong things, no matter how much I tried to phrase the words. He noticed how I kept blabbing and asking him odd questions that were direct, vulgar, and straight up obscene. So he put his hands on my shoulders and asked me to breathe, which I did. Then he asked me what was going on and why I was asking all these weird and uncomfortable questions. I took another breath, and I was able to ask a question that hit the nail on the head. I asked him why he hadn't been intimate with each other. He chuckled and said that he now saw what all this is truly about and where all my questions were coming from. I hid my face in shame, and he chuckled, telling me that it was all right. But he wasn't giving me any answer, so I looked up at him and asked him for an answer, and he told me that I shouldn't worry about it. I didn't understand what that meant, so I told him that I wanted to be intimate with him right there and then. I tried untying the drawstrings of his joggers before I even finished that sentence, but he held my hands before I was successful. I looked at him and he shook his head, signifying that I should stop. I asked him why without even hesitating. I told him that he was hiding something and the options I stated earlier were the only viable ones. Immediately after I said that, he suddenly let go of me, but he did it slowly. I could see that the answer was one he didn't want to give. He walked to the couch and sat on it like he was exhausted all of a sudden. I walked to him, standing in front of him with a stern face and an even sterner pose. My hands were on my waist, and my eyes were set on him, waiting patiently. I began tapping my feet as I waited, and I could feel my ears twitching in anticipation to hear whatever he was going to say. I was restless, but I didn't want to push him. I stood for almost a minute without getting a reply before I called his name. I asked him to talk to me, and he looked up at me. I was getting tired of waiting. The atmosphere was getting dark and stuffy. So in my attempt to try and lighten things up, I jokingly told him that it couldn't be that bad, that it wasn't like he was a virgin, so he could talk to me. He looked up at me, and there was this look he had in his eyes like I had struck a chord. Like I said, I opened my mouth, and the stupid things just flow out of them effortlessly. It was clear that I was right. He was a virgin. And I couldn't believe it. My eyes widened, and I called his name, taking a step back. I asked him if the joke I just made was actually the truth, and he subtly nodded. I knew that my big mouth had blurted out something stupid again. I apologized for running my mouth the way I did, and then I asked if that meant he didn't want to be intimate, even with me. He took a few seconds before he got up and came close to me. He told me that he found me very attractive and he desired me in every way possible, but that being carnal with me, or anyone for that matter, was something he had decided not to do. He took my hand and sat me down, and Henry opened up to me. He opened himself so wide that I looked in and saw the deepest crevices of his soul. Apparently, he was a nerd when he was younger, and he was bullied till he graduated from high school. Others look back at high school and smile at the beautiful memories they made, but that wasn't Henry. Henry's high school memories are a nightmare. He told me how they teased him about everything, even about him being a virgin. It sounded like hell. He saw how some of the people who teased him about being a virgin got pregnant and flunked out of school and so on, and he decided that even if they teased him to the ends of the earth, he wouldn't break his virginity until he was married and ready to have children. My mouth was open for the last part of that revelation. I couldn't believe that such a man actually existed, someone who was led by the flesh and didn't care or make any attempts to satisfy his sensual desires. He said that he hoped I understood why he couldn't go that far with me yet. And to be frank, I understood it, but that didn't mean I agreed with it. I wanted to tell him that he was an adult and that he could use protection, and whatever it was that he was scared of could be easily prevented, but I didn't say it. I was honestly impressed with myself. For once, my mouth didn't run like a broken faucet. I knew this was a sensitive topic for Henry, and he trusted me enough to open up to me, so I hoped that would be enough for the meantime, because it made me feel special that he could confide in me in such a way about something that was so much on him. I gave him a tight hug and told him that it was okay. I was very cautious with what I said or did, because I was sensible enough that day to know that whatever I said there, at that time, was going to be a deciding factor in our relationship. Henry hugged me back, and the next thing he told me was that he was lucky to have someone like me. It made me blush, and I answered modestly, telling him that he was the lucky one. I thought I could do it. I could go without making love with my boyfriend. I tried to convince myself that copulation wasn't important in a relationship, that it was just a side sport that couples do to feel good. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, it just didn't work. And here's the hilarious thing. I wasn't even someone who was interested in intercourse. I didn't go out of my way to indulge in it, and I wasn't big on it as well, but I found myself feeling the overwhelming urge to hook up with my boyfriend. I guess what they say about people wanting what they can't have is true. I didn't think about it when I thought it was easily accessible, but after that I figured out that it wasn't. I suddenly felt like every nerve in my body wanted to be touched by him in all the erotic ways possible. This feeling continued until one day I hung out with my sister and she asked me why I was being a grouch. This was almost 2 months after my deep conversation with Henry, where he confessed everything to me. My sister told me that I kept shooting down any and every idea I brought up about anything, and that I hadn't smiled since I came to see her that day. She said I looked stiffer and angrier. I told her she didn't know what I was talking about, and the next thing she did was pinch the arm. I flared up, shouting at her. She looked at me with eyes that were basically saying, "I told you so." We pinch ourselves as a form of play, and it was something normal between us. But now I turned into a dragon simply because she pinched me. I simmered down and apologized, telling her that I didn't know what was wrong with me. I was lying. I knew what was wrong with me. I just didn't want to say it. It would have made me seem like a freak. I mean, who in the world gets worked up when they can't copulate? But my sister could be very persistent. She asked me if I had a fight with Henry, and I told her that we didn't. The truth was that I was avoiding Henry by all means possible. I knew I would tear his clothes to shreds if I met with him, so I tried to keep my distance, but that was very hard. My sister kept pestering me, asking what was wrong. After some time, I finally caved, telling her that Henry didn't want to have anything to do with me intimately. My sister was confused by the statement, and to get a clearer understanding of what I was saying, she asked me if Henry didn't want to do anything intimate with me in particular, or if he just didn't want to do anything intimate at all. I told her it was the latter, and she laughed and asked why, and I told her that he wanted to get married first. You should have seen how my sister shrugged like it was a normal thing and told me that at least I have something to look forward to in my marriage. I shouted at her, telling her that she should be supporting me and not siding with Henry, but my reaction just made her laugh even more. She told me that there were no sides, that what I had with Henry was something a lot of girls wished they had, a man who was willing to wait until after marriage. I told her that I didn't want to wait, that I could not wait. For all I knew, he might not be planning to propose anytime soon, and even if he proposes, that doesn't mean we would be getting married soon. After all, there are engaged couples who go years without getting married. What was I to do then if we turned out to be those kinds of couples? My sister told me that I was overthinking it, and that I shouldn't worry about it and simply have faith in my boyfriend and hope for the best. I didn't like the things my sister was telling me, so I left. But before I left, the last thing she said to me was that I shouldn't let what I don't have yet ruin what I have now, that I shouldn't let my lust spoil the good thing I had going. I didn't answer her. I just left. On my way back home, I got a text from Henry. In the text, he said that he felt like we had been worlds apart as of late, and he wanted to hang out with me that evening. I didn't know what to do. If I turned him down, then it meant I had to tell a lie as to why I wouldn't be able to hang out with him, because I couldn't simply refuse him without giving him a proper reason. So, with fear and worry coursing through my veins instead of blood, I agreed. I went home first and freshened up, then got changed. He told me he would come pick me up, so I waited for him, but while I did, I could feel my chest beating with all the might in the world. My palms were sweating, and my teeth kept gnashing as though I was in danger. I was no longer exhaling carbon dioxide. Rather, it was steamy lust that was exuding from my chest cavities. Every second that ticked by was a trickle of wetness soaking me up. I was startled and almost leaked onto the entire floor when a sudden knock hit my door. I shook my head and made my way to the door, but I did it slowly. I was worried, really worried. The time had come, and I was frightened that I was going to slip up and do something that would ruin the night that I knew Henry had planned out to be so romantic. I gently opened the door, and I saw him standing there with a rose in his mouth and a bouquet in hand. I couldn't believe the corniness of this guy, but it made me laugh and blush, and I felt my heart grow an inch bigger. He gave me the flower, gave me a kiss, and told me that he missed me so much, and I told him I missed him so much too. That was the truth. Not even a letter in that sentence was a lie. I missed him more than I could explain, but I couldn't exactly do anything about that. He had made a commitment and promise to himself, and I didn't want to be the one to make him destroy that promise he had made to himself. He offered me his arm, waiting for me to take it so he'd lead me to the car, but I first asked him where we were going. He smiled and told me that it was a secret. Those words made me even more cautious. Wherever we were going, I just hoped it wasn't somewhere private. Because if it were, I don't think I'd be able to keep myself away from him. I just smiled after what he said, and I took his arm. Then he led me to the car. He opened the car for me and waited for me to get in. As I walked past him and got into the car, I looked into his eyes, and the way he smiled at me made me melt. I sank into the seat and watched as he closed the door. My eyes went straight to the gear stick, and very vile thoughts began flowing through my mind. After a few seconds, the door at the driver's seat opened, and Henry got into the driver's seat. He smiled at me and asked me if I was ready. I faked a smile and told him that I was as ready as I could be. I didn't want any of these romantic excesses, at least not at that time. What I wanted was to feel good, to be pleasured and handled in a way that I hadn't been before. It was safe to say that I was enthusiastic about whatever he was taking me to. The drive was okay. Luckily, there was no traffic, so we got to the destination on time. It was a fancy restaurant. But not just any fancy restaurant. It was the one I always talked about when we were together. He had made a reservation for the two of us, and I couldn't believe it. On a normal day, I might have jumped on him and screamed like my life depended on it. But I wasn't in the mood that day. I hadn't been in the mood for anything else for quite some time. We were shown to our seats, and even the bottle of wine that was brought to our table made me think about things I shouldn't. And it only got worse from there. Henry talked about a lot of things, but mostly about us. He was so excited to see me that I honestly felt very bad that I couldn't reciprocate the excitement he was feeling as well. I just smiled and nodded at the things he said, not replying with many words. He noticed how I wasn't enthusiastic and asked me if I was okay. I told him that I was fine, and he looked at me with curious eyes. It was only a matter of time before he realized that he and I weren't on the same wavelength. He sat quietly for a few seconds, and before I knew it, he reached over the table and planted a kiss on my lips. I felt every bit of his lips encompassing mine as we exchanged breaths. While his breath was fuel, mine was fire, and he ignited every urge that I had been trying to suppress, and they all exploded up to my chest like a volcano erupting. I suddenly felt the saliva on my tongue heat up, and I grabbed Henry's hair in intense delight, kissing him like it was just the two of us in the restaurant. I only left him when I felt myself running out of breath. He sat back on his chair and looked at me in shock, completely startled by how intense that got. He smiled and asked me if I missed him that much. I guess he interpreted that deep kiss as my way of showing him how much I missed him. I blushed and said yes. He then asked me what I would like to eat. I thought about it. It was the perfect solution to the burden. I thought that if I overfed, I'd not feel that urge that was burning through me anymore. And so I began making orders. I told Henry that I was so hungry and that I needed to go through as much food as he could give me. He laughed and told me that I could order whatever I wanted. I wasn't some brainless girlfriend who would order the most expensive things on the menu. I was considerate. I just made sure to eat to my full, and I did. I had some wine on the side to wash down the food, and by the end of our date night, all I could feel was the aching of my full stomach. He watched me eat for most of the night, barely touching his food. It seemed as though he was intrigued with me, like I was some science experiment that he was monitoring or observing. It was sweet and weird at the same time. I would ask him why he was looking at me, and he would blush and tell me that it was nothing. I was confused by his behavior that night. I asked him if he wasn't going to eat the steak on his plate because I wanted it, and he told me that I could have it because he had eaten earlier. I wanted to be sure that he actually ate before coming there, and that he wasn't just giving me the steak because I asked, so I asked him what he ate. He told me that he had chicken breasts before he came, but he didn't just tell me what he ate, he told me how he prepared it and how he ate it. He said that he beat the meat up properly to make it very soft before he fried it and ate it. He spoke of how delicious the meat was, and said that it was so tasty that he licked his fingers when he was done. And I must say, everything he was saying sounded so sensual to me. I asked him if he knew how to do all that, or if he was just fantasizing. My voice was a bit louder than usual, and people around could hear me. I think it's proper to point out that I had taken a bit of alcohol, and alcohol in my veins, no matter how little, is never good for my tongue, because it wags even more than it normally does whenever I take alcohol. He told me that he prepared the chicken by himself, that he learned how to cook at a young age. I knew this. He had told me this before. I laughed and said that I wasn't talking about the chicken. I told him that he was making sensual innuendos, also jokingly adding that after all, he was still a virgin, a 35-year-old virgin. I then asked a very cruel question. I asked him what a virgin knew about fingering, licking, eating, and beating meat. He couldn't believe it. Henry's face tightened into a frown, and he slowly got up. A small box fell from his thighs, and an engagement ring fell out of it. He picked it up, then looked at me with eyes that could peel the life off a person. Without even saying a word, he walked away. I didn't know it then, but I had lost the love of my life right there. One woman who sat at the table next to ours sighed at me and said that I went too far. And to be honest, I really did. I really went too far. Update. That night, Henry paid for our meals before he even left. That's how much of a gentleman he was. No matter how angry he was, there were lines he couldn't cross. I went home that night and slept like a fish, not knowing the consequences of what I had done. It was when I woke up the next morning that I realized how far I had gone with my words. I screamed my lungs out to the point that my neighbors ran to come check up on me. I had to try and convince them that there was nothing wrong, but they didn't want to take my word for it. They came in to check the house to make sure that I was actually fine. After they left, I tried calling Henry, but he wasn't picking up. I quickly freshened up and hurried to his house. I knocked and called his name so much that people around started looking at me as though I was a mad woman, but even with all my dramatics at his door, he didn't answer me. I didn't know if he was home or not, but I didn't like the idea of being ignored. I tried calling him on the phone again, but this time, his number was switched off. I was so frustrated that I sat on the porch of his house and began crying. I didn't know what to do. I called my sister crying, and she asked me what was happening and why I sounded like the world was ending. I tried to talk, but my words kept coming out in tears and murmurs. She asked me to come over, but I told her that I needed to be there in case Henry came back. She was so worried that she told me that she was going to come meet me. My sister knew where Henry stayed. He had invited us over for meals and a get-togethers in the past, so she came as quickly as she could. When she got there, I was still seated on the porch. She hugged me tight and asked me what happened. I narrated what I could remember, and I did the narration while crying. She was so mad at me and told me that she warned me about this already, but I refused to listen. She said that my lust finally won, and then the question she asked that broke me was if I still felt the urge. In all honesty, I didn't. It had been overtaken by worry and fear of losing Henry. I sat out there for hours, and even though my sister was angry at me, she stayed by my side. But after all the waiting, we never saw Henry. It was like he had traveled or something. My sister begged me to go back home, and she promised me that she would try to reach out to Henry herself. It was after all her assurances that I was only able to leave Henry's porch that day. A few days later, I got a package in the mail from an unknown person. It was a phone with a letter attached to it. I was curious about who would be sending me a phone, so I checked the letter, and it was a message from Henry. He told me that since I liked using people's weaknesses to make fun of them, it was time for me to get a taste of my own medicine. I was so scared of what he was talking about. I put on the phone and checked what was on it. There was just one video. I played the video, and it was a video of me bullying a little girl when I was in high school. I could not fathom how he found such a video. I was so shocked. My phone rang immediately, and my sister asked me if I was trying to destroy my life. I didn't know what she was talking about. Apparently, the video had been posted on my social media account. I fell on my knees. The only thought that came to mind was, how could he do this to me? I fell on my knees. I then got a text on my phone from Henry telling me that it was over between us and that we were even, so I shouldn't try to reach out to him again. I brought out a monster. I ruined such a perfect thing because of carnality.